The atmosphere inside the arena shifted long before the screens went black. It wasn't the kind of electric anticipation that usually precedes a main event, but rather a sudden, suffocating drop in barometric pressure that made the air feel heavy in the lungs of 15,000 people. The tag team match in the ring, which had been moving at a frantic, high-flying pace, began to stutter as the competitors themselves seemed to sense a change in the gravity of the room. They glanced toward the entrance ramp, not because they were told to, but because the crowd had stopped making noise. It wasn't a hush of reverence. It was the quiet of confusion, the sound of thousands of people murmuring to their neighbors, asking if the production truck had lost power or if something had gone terribly wrong with the broadcast. The commentary team, usually so quick to fill dead air with hyperbole, fell into a genuine, unscripted silence that bled through the television feed, making the viewer at home feel like an intruder on a private disaster. Michael Cole tapped his headset, his face drained of its usual broadcast sheen, looking toward the gorilla position for a cue that never came. The LED boards that wrap around the arena balcony flickered once, then died completely, plunging the upper decks into shadow and leaving only the harsh, white ring lights illuminating the canvas. This wasn't the polished darkness of a planned entrance. It felt industrial, raw, and accidental. The wrestlers in the ring ceased their grappling, breaking character as they backed into the turnbuckles, their eyes darting between the darkened stage and the restless sea of fans. The uneasy atmosphere curdled into legitimate anxiety. People weren't looking for a superstar anymore. They were looking for an exit, sensing that the script had been burned and reality was intruding. Then came the sound, but it wasn't music. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated the floorboards. A synthesized distortion that sounded like a queen's fanfare played backward through a broken speaker. It was unrecognizable, yet hauntingly familiar, scratching at the back of the audience's collective memory. There was no pyrotechnics display, no explosion of gold and glitter that usually heralds royalty. Instead, a single spotlight snapped on at the top of the ramp, revealing a silhouette that stood completely motionless. The figure was not dressed in the sequined robes of a champion or the branded merchandise of a hero. She wore street clothes, a dark leather trench coat, and combat boots stripped of all pageantry. When she stepped forward, the light hit her face, and the gasp from the crowd was audible, a sharp intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the arena. It was her, but it wasn't the version of her they remembered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrifying intensity that looked more like grief than confidence. She didn't pose, she didn't twirl, she didn't acknowledge the fans who were now standing on their chairs, caught between the urge to cheer and the paralyzing feeling that they were witnessing a breakdown. She walked down the ramp with a slow, predatory cadence, her eyes locked on the ring with a focus that felt dangerous. The commentary team didn't scream her name. Graves muttered a single word of disbelief, his voice trembling, while the fans remained in a suspended state of shock. This wasn't a triumphant return to reclaim a throne. It was an invasion. The energy in the building wasn't joy. It was the hair-raising sensation of watching a predator enter a cage where the door had been locked from the inside. She slid under the bottom rope, ignoring the steel steps, a movement that felt scrappy and desperate rather than regal. Inside the ring, the current champion stood frozen, clutching the belt to her chest, not as a prize, but as a shield. The referee, sensing the volatility, signaled for the bell to ring, effectively canceling the match, but the bell never rang. The timekeeper was watching the returnee, mesmerized by the sheer weight of her presence. She stood in the center of the ring and slowly unbuttoned the leather coat, letting it drop to the canvas to reveal plain black gear, devoid of logos or color. It was a visual rejection of the brand, a statement that she was no longer playing the game by their corporate rules. She didn't ask for a microphone. She didn't need to cut a promo to explain why she was there because her body language screamed a narrative of unfinished business and resentment. The camera zoomed in on her face, catching the bags under her eyes and the set of her jaw. She looked at the champion, and for the first time, the crowd saw the rage simmering beneath the calm. It was a stare that promised violence, not competition. When the champion tried to take a step back, the returnee stepped forward, mirroring the movement, closing the distance until they were nose to nose. The silence in the arena was so profound that you could hear the scuff of boots on the canvas. Then she smiled, not the polished, media-trained smile of a superstar, but a jagged, broken expression that signaled the collapse of order. She raised a single finger, touched the title belt, and then turned her back, walking away without throwing a single punch, leaving the violence hanging in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. The broadcast cut immediately to the backstage area. But instead of a polished interview segment, the camera shook as the operator jogged to keep up with the chaos. Security guards were scrambling, whispering into their earpieces, their faces etched with legitimate panic. We saw glimpses of the locker room leaders, veterans who have seen everything huddled together with looks of genuine concern. This wasn't the usual kayfabe drama. This was the reaction to an unstable element being reintroduced into a fragile ecosystem. The younger talent, the women who had risen in her absence, looked terrified. They realized in that moment that their spot on the card, their screen time, and their narratives were about to be cannibalized by a force of nature that refused to be managed. In the background, producers were yelling, trying to regain control of a show that had spiraled. We saw a brief shot of her family members who were backstage, perhaps visiting, looking not proud but worried, as if they knew the toll this return would take on her psyche. The media scrum that usually waits for sound bites was ignored completely. She walked right past them, eyes fixed on a point in the distance, radiating a coldness that froze the journalists in place. The narrative established here was clear. The locker room wasn't preparing for a match. They were preparing for a war. The returning star hadn't just come back to wrestle, she had come back to dismantle the hierarchy. The tension was palpable, a thick fog of anxiety that suggested the script had been thrown out the window. The establishment was scrambling because they realized they had invited a wolf back into the fold, and they no longer held the leash. As the show went off the air, the screen didn't fade to a copyright logo immediately. It lingered on a black and white slow-motion replay of her eyes during the stare-down. The audience at home was left not with the thrill of a surprise, but with a heavy, sinking feeling in their stomachs. This return wasn't designed to sell t-shirts. It was designed to sell consequences. We are forced to ask ourselves why we crave these moments. Demand our heroes destroy themselves for our entertainment, breaking their bodies and their minds to hold a piece of leather and gold. She came back not because she wanted to, but because she is addicted to the light, even when it burns her. The lingering question isn't who she will fight next or when she will win the title. The question is much darker. By stripping away the pageantry, the music, and the glitz, she forced us to look at the human being beneath the character, a person haunted by her own legacy. The episode ends leaving the viewer complicit. We cheered for her return, but in doing so, we unlocked a cage that perhaps should have stayed closed. The shock has faded, replaced by a somber realization that this isn't a redemption story. It is a tragedy in motion. The queen has returned to her kingdom, but looking at the wreckage she left in her wake in just 5 minutes, one has to wonder if there will be anything left to rule when she is finished. The screen cuts to black, leaving us in silence.